This is Rebuilders, the leaders we need for the decade ahead. Here's your host, Paul Shoemaker.
The conversation I'm trying to convene on Rebuilders is about the kinds of leaders and leadership we're going to need in the decade ahead. I think there are 5 very vital traits, but some of these folks I talk to, they add to that perspective and they have some of their own ideas. So you will hear some of that today from Kathy Calvin. You'll hear some familiar themes like cross-sector leadership. Maybe the most interesting part for me is towards the end. And you'll hear her talk about 2 sentences. They both include the word learn. And I do stop and I call them out, so you'll know when they happen. But I'm still thinking about both of those quotes that she gave me. Keep an eye out for those. Towards the end, she also sort of unintentionally, we foreshadow a conversation I'm going to have with my next guest, Michelle Nunn, about the role of women in leadership in the decade ahead. So I think you're really going to enjoy listening to Kathy Calvin. It's fun. Her energy and her pace grows as the conversation goes along, as you will hear. It's great to be with Kathy Calvin today. Every time I do a show, I feel like the last person I talked to was just the best, and then the next person tops it. So Kathy very much represents that for me. Great to have you today. How are you doing?
Thanks. I'm great, Paul. I'm so happy to be here and great to catch up with you.
Awesome.
Happy to be part of this.
Let me start with a question I start with everybody with is, from your perspective, and you think about the years, the decade ahead, what do you think is the most important attribute of leaders that we're going to need in the future?
I think like everybody else, I've been thinking about the years ahead a lot. This is a critical decade, obviously. It was a critical decade going to be because we knew we had to get where the Sustainable Development Goals were going to take us in 2030. We have a lot of work to do, but we learned a lot more in 2020 about what else we have to be doing that we hadn't even prioritized. So I think for leaders, the challenge is how to do what you think you do well, but in a new environment where other qualities are going to be needed in that decade. And I thought the 5 you chose to highlight in your book are well done. They're so smart. I'm happy to be part of the cross-sector fluency mindset because I think that's a really critical one. But the 2 I would add to the 5 you did are resilience and humility. And I think resilience because we've learned this year that challenges come up in every direction from every part of our ecosystem. Yep. And we have to be prepared for them and we have to help others get through them. And I picked humility because, oh my God, did we learn a lot this year about what we don't know and what we don't know how to do and what we've misunderstood about our colleagues, our employees, our business partners, and our customers. And so I think that humility is part of what every leader has to bring to the table in the next 10 years to be genuinely authentic, one of your other traits. And I think those are traits regardless of whether you're in the private sector, the nonprofit sector, or the government sector, or whether you're a parent. You've got to use all of those. So those are my 2 additions to your excellent list.
Being a parent makes you humble. You have no choice.
It sure does.
Those are great answers. Let me just tell everybody a little bit about Kathy before we keep going with the conversation. Like a lot of the rebuilders I talk to, she has a career that spanned work in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. From 76 through 84, she was Senator Gary Hart's press secretary for both his Senate and presidential campaign. She was one of the first women to hold that title in American politics. Then she went on to the director of editorial administration at U.S. News and World Report, then a managing director at Hill and Knowlton. And then in 1997, she went on to serve as the senior VP and communications officer of America Online. And after that, she was president of the AOL Time Warner Foundation. And she guided all of their philanthropic and corporate responsibility initiatives. She joined the United Nations Foundation in 2003, first as their chief operating officer. Then she was their CEO and then president and CEO in 2013, and she retired at the end of 2019. She has been someone that's had an active role in a range of activities on the boards of the International Women's Media Foundation, City Year, Internews. I don't have enough time to tell you all the boards she's been on. Passionate advocate for multi-sector problem solving, U.S. leadership on global issues, and the inclusion of women at all levels and in all sectors. I can't think of a job that's much more complex than the United Nations Foundation CEO. And I can't think of a career that probably better prepared her for it. So that's a little bit about Kathy. As you sort of formed your leadership style over the course of that career, Kathy, and the beliefs you've had, who have been a few role models along the way for you? Anybody stand out?
Oh man, I have so many role models. I've been really lucky. I work for Steve Case at AOL, as you mentioned,
Yep.
and Steve's still a mentor and still a role model for me. Everything from his ability to look into the future and see what might be coming our way and how he could help it. And I'll talk a little bit later if we get to it about how he envisioned AOL's mission statement, because it to me said everything about
Yep.
what he was about and how we thought about the world. Steve often said it's a marathon, not a sprint, which I took to heart and I think is one of the most critical ways we all can lead is by owning that long-term thinking. Another role model is Bill Shore. I don't know if you know Billy Shore.
Absolutely.
He started an amazing guy. He started Share Our Strength in 1984 while we were sitting there in Gary Hart's senatorial office. He was moved to do something else as if there was time enough to do anything. And Billy's built something truly amazing. He's written a bunch of books like The Cathedral Builder. And he just showed me that passion makes all the world of the difference. That you can get anyone to follow you if you have
Yep.
a passion in your own makeup. And then I'll just mention a UN leader, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was once the Prime Minister of Norway, then was the head of the World Health Organization. We all today know how critical that job is and was. And she's a woman who just showed how women can be underestimated and over-deliver. And I have learned so much from her along the way. She happens to be on the UN Foundation Board of Directors. She was the executive director for a long time. And I to this day think of Gru when I need to know, what would I do now? She's a good one to look to. And I'll just mention one other person, Paul Polman, who I think as a business leader showed a generation of business leaders that you can be strong in achieving your business goals and even stronger in achieving them if you also bring social and justice goals along the way. And what he did to help other leaders, I think, recognize that we have a unique set of missions in the business sector that have to do with people and profit and also planet, really was ground changing.
Yep. He used to be kind of lonely. He's not so lone anymore. That's a
good thing.
Yeah, it's a very good thing. Did much change on your leadership, sort of a philosophy and approach all those years from, back with Gary Hart to AOL, the United Nations Foundation? Did anything big change for you, or is it just sort of like the rest of us, you kind of learned as you went?
Oh boy, I learned as I went. And I didn't actually see myself as a leader. I always thought I was a great number two. I was a great press secretary. I was a great COO, which I was when I came into the UN Foundation. It was a hurdle for me to become and recognize in myself leadership qualities because I was unprepared and a little resistant to taking on the mantle of leadership because I just wanted to be part of a team. I wanted to be a great team player and I wanted to move us all forward. I've learned along the way that you have to be able to communicate your vision. You have to inspire people around you. And you have to be willing to take some stands even when you're not even sure of where you want to stand. And those were really hard lessons for me along the way. And I watched others succeed or fail at doing them. But I think this is typical of women more than men, but maybe men more than we know, coming to find the leader in themselves and embracing it without becoming a dogmatic, bureaucratic leader in that form, which I think is way last century. I think, the new forms of leaders are, whether it's, you call it a service leader or you call it many other things, it is something you have to grow into by working a a lot of different methods to get there. So I watched people when I was at AOL, where I wasn't necessarily a leader of the entire group, but of my own group, and tried to mirror some things. And I think one thing I learned really quickly is, people are watching you every single day. Mm-hmm. And so you have to be willing to not just make the statement of purpose, but actually show that you live it and deliver it and can help others achieve it as well. And those are just a lot of things to be thinking about all the time. But I think that is what makes a genuinely good leader.
It's so interesting hearing you say that you were sort of found your way into leadership. You definitely strike me as somebody that knows how to lead, and that humility about it's probably part of what got you there. And I'm a absolute believer that men are half as smart as they think they are, and women are twice as smart as they think they are, but that's a subject for a whole other day. We'll get to that later on some other time.
Sign me up for that one.
Yeah. One of the things you and I have talked about more than once is how you were in the public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector. What did you learn from being in all three sectors like that? Are there things that you learned in one sector that helped you in another one?
Yeah, well, somebody once called me a tri-sector athlete, which I thought was a great phrase. And I'm a big fan of serving in all three sectors. When I talk to young people all the time, I say, it doesn't really matter what the order is, but you learn something in each one. And I think the biggest areas where there's some difference between the three sectors, or among them, is speed of decision making. And so you learn a lot about the values of deliberative decision making, which you see in government. Sometimes you see it in the nonprofit sector, speedier thinking and decision making in the private sector. Yep. But I think, and I'll say this about all other traits, there's a growing merging of all three sectors' strengths in all organizations of the future. So whether Steve Case used to actually say that the private sector doesn't have the market cornered on efficiency, and the nonprofit sector doesn't have the market cornered on compassion. If you're a successful organization today, you are doing both because you're about problem solving. And you could be doing that from a nonprofit or a company. Certainly government, you should be doing that. So I think the speed is one of the differences. The language is the other. There's such different language in the three sectors. And if you can't speak all three languages, you can't really work across the three sectors. And I know you profile Michelle Nunn, who's a perfect example of somebody who really gets the values and assets of all three sectors and knows how to apply them to make each stronger and have each deliver its own value. And value is not about money in this case. It's often about skills and commitment and trying to resolve some of the same problems in the same places, but by using different tools. And so partnering together really makes sense. So I think there's increasing appreciation by each sector for the other sector's strengths, and figuring out who comes to the fore to get the problem solved together is going to be the name of the game for everybody in the future.
And speed and language, that does resonate with me. And that's that quote you said from Steve. I literally remember reading that back in the late 80s, early 90s. So it's so funny you say that, because I absolutely remember when he said that. And it seemed a little bit weird at the time. Now I totally understand what he was talking about.
Right. Typical Steve.
Yeah, exactly. A little bit ahead of his time. So I have a bias on this question, but given your communications background, you're a good person to ask this. I think a lot about sort of the splintering of media and how much the digital divide at times seems to be growing. I'm curious if you feel like the evolution of media and the digital divide, does that make leading, especially during COVID, do you think that makes it harder to be a leader, or is it just an adjustment and that's just the way the world is?
I think it definitely makes it harder. And whether it's an adjustment that we just have to now all understand is probably a debatable point.
Yeah.
It sure seems like it's not going to change. I can't picture the way back.
Right.
The hardest thing, I think, and I've watched my successor at the UN Foundation this year, because she had to deal with COVID, the rising justice movement, and having employees not together in any way. And I think the other issue that is really at play right now is trust. And we've learned to not trust because everything gets exposed today. And so the going in presumption is a lack of trust as opposed to goodwill and trust, which I think the American century, the 20th century, seem to have been built on. So I think that's a critical component for the success of any organization, whether you're the Catholic Church or you're a multinational company. If your employees don't have trust that you're standing for things they care about, if your customers don't have trust that you have values in the right places and you will be reliable to stick to those values, I don't think you can make it. And yet trust is so hard to prove. It's so much easier to disprove that I think we have to have a whole new lesson in learning about what trust is made up of and what it looks like and how to convey it. And again, it goes back to authenticity because you can't really make it up.
We've learned to not trust. I could sort of stop on that one sentence right there. And wow. I mean, you're right. That's just a really profound, strong statement. Well, and the digital media the whole notion of fake news just adds to that. Yes. That you have to have your guard up all the time. And, this, I'd love to hear your thought on this because I think you've watched the evolution, which we all saw in the 90s is, oh my God, it will be so amazing when we can get information at our fingertips and make it equally free and available. And we can talk to anybody we want to. But the dark sides are that the wrong people use all the good tools. Always. No, you're right. It's like a sort of an epic battle right now between good and evil when it comes to tech. And I don't know that we sure who's going to win right now. When I talked to you for the book that I wrote, I was so struck by how complex a place like the United Nations Foundation and its work can be. I literally almost can't think of anything or any leadership role that would be more complex. So this is kind of a big question. I'm going to hope you can sort of narrow it down for me. How in that role, did you sort of deal with that much complexity and try to make sense of it as a leader and for the people that worked for you? Yeah. When I joined the foundation in 2003, I didn't totally appreciate it. I was a little surprised. This is where my career had ended up. I'm not a foreign policy smarty pants. I knew a little about the UN. I didn't know a lot. I was in model UN in high school, But what I got was that the foundation in Ted Turner's vision was not about teaching Americans about foreign policy and certainly not about teaching the UN about foreign policy. It was about helping Americans in particular, but people around the world appreciate the value of multilateralism. That after the war, when the UN was created, it was the biggest principle of all. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was then the first lady, I think became its biggest champion because she saw that it stood for human rights and peace and prosperity. And I became convinced that our job at the United Nations Foundation was actually one of communications. And that's my natural place. So right. it made it somewhat easier that we would find lots of different ways to engage young people in understanding the work of multilateralism, whether it's delivering bed nets to Africa so people can stay alive in the face of malaria, whether it was helping the World Food Program, which just won a Nobel Prize, deliver food around the world and end world hunger and famine, whether it was helping the WHO this year raise enough money to deliver a really significant COVID response initiative. And so we did a lot of things. We created campaigns. We did lobbying on Capitol Hill. We helped the UN itself tell its own stories. Big institutions have trouble doing that often. And our staff of 300 was just very mission driven every day to come in and try to make a difference and support the UN. And so it's funny because then are you supposed to be supporting and publicizing your own organization, the UN Foundation? As Ted Turner said, the UN Foundation doesn't need publicity. The UN does. So our job every day was to actually point the spotlight in that direction and help them. And we have a very unique relationship with the UN in that they let us use their name, which, oh my God, you look back 20 years ago about when Ted Turner gave his original gift to the UN of $1 billion. Yep. They just thought we were going to keep giving them money. And we finally convinced them, giving them money, okay, everybody can do that. We'll do our part. But the bigger thing we could do is give them support,
help build their reputation, help build the relationship to the private sector, which absolutely did not exist at that point at all. So all those things became part of our toolkit of responsibilities. And it was a great time to lead through that because the whole world began looking at the UN as a problem solver that they wanted to be involved with. And so the Millennium Development Goals leading to the Sustainable Development Goals really wouldn't be where they are today if there weren't organizations from corporations to nonprofits to Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, all of whom wanted to be part of that big movement. So we were movement builders.
Yep. So you touched on it. Let me keep going on that. You and I love to talk about cross-sector. When you said you came in and the private sector really sort of wasn't part of the equation, I know by the time you left, it sure in the heck was. How did you think about what was the role of the private sector in your work with the United Nations Foundation?
Well, we looked at what the problems were, and the problems required really big solutions, logistical support, financial support, of course, but that's true of everything.
Yep.
But one example is that it takes a cold chain. We've now heard this term around vaccines a lot in order to deliver vaccines. Well, who does cold chains better than Coca-Cola? They can get a Coke to you in the most remote part of the world. Well, wouldn't it be great if they could deliver vaccines too? So I think there became a new era of understanding the private sector had services, skills, and assets that were really needed for the kind of global problem solving at scale that needed to be done. And at the same time, they too were recognizing that building a new middle class of potential purchasers of soap or Coke or telecommunications was a valuable thing to them as well. And they wanted strong, resilient, peaceful communities and countries because that allowed them to get their cocoa if you were Mars. And so I think the era was one of recognizing shared vision and then pairing up the strategic assets that would come together. And then we had some great leaders who really thought this was the right avenue for their own global growth and for the world. And so they wanted to be part of something that was so much bigger. Kofi Annan created the Global Compact in 2020. In 2000, it's 20 years old now. I think that was another way that the private sector came in. And the UN Foundation was not the only player in this. I mean, so many big nonprofits really in the same window came to understand that the right way to work with the private sector was to recognize what they had to offer and create genuine partnerships.
Yep. One thing you said in there I think is so true. It's good if the private sector sort of believes in it altruistically, and that's important. It's even better if it's also in sort of their mutual business self-interest. And when you can make those things come together, like you said, create a shared vision, that has some real power and some real stickiness. You mentioned something earlier I wanted to make sure I touched on. When you were at AOL with Steve back in the early days, I do remember AOL talking about being a company with a purpose. And back then, there weren't a whole lot of folks saying that. So
right.
How did that come about way back then? Why was AOL, why did it think of itself as a company, not just to make money, but with a purpose beyond that?
Yeah. So this was around 1998, which is like generations ago at this point. And I think AOL had a very typical mission statement, like unleashing the power of coders around the world to make information easier or something. I mean, it was good. It sort of said what they were doing, but it missed taking it to a higher level. It missed bringing everybody in and sharing the same mission. So we actually worked on it for quite a while, and we finally came up with what is still great, and it was on a wall there for the longest time. It was to build a global medium as central to people's lives as the telephone and the television. And then we added an even more valuable, because our recognition was that we wanted to have that global reach and global accessibility, but it had to be to deliver something of power and value and goodness. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about what would the internet do for the nonprofit sector that it can't do today? What would it do for teaching? What would it do for shopping? What would it do for parenting? And that was such an exciting, inspiring opportunity for all of the 20,000 staff at AOL to be really involved in creating a medium. I mean, who thought about creating a new medium back then? It was bold and audacious, but it had purpose built in. And I think when it's built in, it's so much stronger because then every day you're testing yourself against it. I would walk around the building and you'd see that mission statement taped on people's monitors because they kind of wanted to live it every single day. It really matters. So today, I think we have a lot of people making purposeful statements, but until you can make sure that you're sort of delivering. And my favorite anecdote from then is that, we kept saying, well, we wanted it to be for all people of all needs. And the internet at that time was becoming something of a public utility, as you recall. And the Society for the Blind sued us because they said, well, it's not accessible. You have to be able to read a computer screen. And they challenged us to find some new and different ways to reach the hearing impaired, the visually impaired. And that helped everybody. We ended up with some things with different size type that was really large. So that was great for older people. We ended up with lots of new kinds of mouse technology. So I think inside AOL, that was a big lesson as well, that when you truly are open to what your mission statement stands for, then you're also truly open to new ideas and new technologies and new products to offer people. And that worked for everybody.
That's a very cool story. We could spend a half hour on that topic too. That's great. Couple more questions. I always think it's a little bit interesting to think about this. If now, given all the experiences you've had, if you were talking to a 20-something today, or if you were talking to a 20-something version of yourself, are there one or two sort of pieces of leadership advice you would really want them to hear from you? Anything stand out?
Yeah. I think one of the hardest lessons, particularly when you're young, is not to take things personally. So a lot's going to come your way. People are going to disagree with you.
That's great.
Men are going to tell you not to speak when you're at a meeting. Whatever. You can't take it personally, because if you get caught up in that, you're missing the lesson that might be trying to get through to you, and it just puts you in the way of the relationship that you really need to have. So it took me a long time not to take things personally and not to both like being hurt by something and feeling guilty for everything. I mean, that's just human nature. But I think if I could say one thing, don't take it personally. The other one is you have to learn how to continue to learn. Because after a while, you feel like you've learned everything and now you just have to deliver. But in fact, you have to keep learning. And so I think there's a challenge and a real skill to learning how you can be persuaded to change your mind. What does it take for you to open up enough? What does it take for you to hear, maybe that's not still the right way to do things because it's what you did for 20 years. What could you do to be more persuadable by someone who has the right argument for today? And I think sometimes we close ourselves down from letting that happen. And that I wish I had done that earlier in my life.
You have to learn how to continue to learn.
Yeah.
That's another great phrase you just shared with me. So just to wrap us up, we are sort of moving into this, new year. When you look at leaders around you right now, and a lot of my conversations are about the decade ahead of us, do you feel hopeful about the next 10 years when you see the leaders around you and we think about your successor, the people you worked with? Are you not sure yet? Time will tell.
I am totally hopeful. I think there is such a sea change of thinking and action that started this year, but was already coming. I think we got a big boost to it this year. I think we're about to see a generation change. I think we're about to see people of various forms of diversity come into leadership positions because it's time and they're finally going to get a chance. So we're going to get all the benefits of their background and knowledge. And I think there's a growing movement of people who are finding each other and supporting each other along the way. So there's something called Imperative 21 that came together around the time of the anniversary of the Milton Friedman view of capitalism to say, it's time to undo that view of capitalism and think about what capitalism really stands for today. It's who's at the table, what are we trying to do, what are we doing about the planet? And I think there are more and more people who don't necessarily all call it the same thing, but who are all thinking about the same thing. And not that it's going to be totally easy, and we have to deal with all kinds of other people who are fighting, not owning their place at the table still as change takes place. But I am really excited and hopeful and optimistic, even more than hopeful, but I'm actually optimistic that we're going to see a really great decade ahead.
That's good to hear that. I don't wake up every morning feeling that way, but most days I do. So that's good to hear that from somebody like you. When I get the chance to talk to somebody like Kathleen Calvin, there's certain things I expect to hear. What's wonderful about it is there's a whole bunch of things I didn't expect to learn and hear from you that I did today. So thank you so much for your time today, and Happy New Year here in a few days.
Thanks so much, Paul. And I'm really looking forward to reading the book and starting my 2021 with that.
Awesome.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Rebuilders Podcast. For more information, resources, and episodes, visit paulshoemaker.org. That's paulshoemaker.org.